Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Francisco Franco is still dead. No, wait, that's something else entirely. Welcome to the first of the Don't Go Out Onto the Moors podcast shorts. And right, we're the podcast that talks about British genre cinema, not just in terms of the cinematic qualities, but also what these films can tell us about the societies that they were made in. Uh, and I am joined by the lovely Dina, who just cut my hair, by the way. So I don't look like a crazy person tonight, which is good. And I will freely pimp Dina. If you do not want to look like a crazy person, get your hair cut by her. This is the first of what's going to be a series of shorts, sort of, because the pod is, centered around British cinema and British genre cinema. But the Brits in the 50s and the 60s weren't the only people in Europe doing these movies. The Italians were doing them, the French were doing them, Eastern Europe was doing them, and so too was Spain. So what we're going to do is these shorter episodes is just going to be me and Dean. It's going to be like a micro series within the podcast where we talk about uh the how the genre cinema of these other European countries in some way, shape, or form, speaks to what is going on in those countries at that given time. So we decided to pick Spain. I think we were talking about this originally, Spain or Italy. We decided to do Spain for two reasons. Severin, which is a great DVD label, as you all should do. Most people listening to this podcast know that, are releasing a crazy set in the next couple months with films from the immediate post dictatorship era. So I think this is kind of cool because it might get people to buy that set or appreciate the set a little bit differently. And we didn't agree to do this, but going back to my, intro, the 50th anniversary of Franco's death was literally like last week. And so, if you're going to talk about Spanish horror films or Spanish genre films, the dictatorship, the Civil War kind of looms large.
Sure.
Uh,
It sure does.
and it's kind of crazy too because Dina studied history. Dina knows stuff, lots of stuff. It's kind of crazy how little American university courses and fuck high school maybe briefly talk about the Spanish Civil War,
Or
but
ever.
only in its relationship to like it happened before World War II, and that's the
Mhm.
end. Uh, how really little the conflict is talked about
Yeah.
and how little Americans know about it. Now, part of it might have to do with, especially once the Cold War starts, like the bad guys are now the good guys
Yeah.
for Americans. So you don't want to dwell upon, hey, we're buddies with this fascist guy. Which we were. But so that might be part of it. I mentioned this in the opening episode, and I think it's worth repeating it. Genre cinema, and particularly horror, although with the with dictatorship, horror is kind of central in all things, uh, is a reflection of what a society doesn't really want to talk about. And in the case of Spain, my God, does that apply? You have the trauma of a brutal, ideologically fueled civil war, where, I mean, look, you see Karl Marx in the background. We are lefties on this podcast, but war crimes committed by all sides. I mean, a lot of dead nuns shot up by anarchists during the conflict. Right. And then, geez, 40 years of dictatorship,
Yeah.
where
It's
Spain
crazy.
is kind of effectively a closed society. Now, before we talk about the films and a little bit about censorship and stuff like that, those of you who listen to the podcast that I used to do, or occasionally still do, on the soccer, the football, you can go back, and if you want a much more detailed sort of description of, the Franco era and what I have to say about it, you guys can tune into that episode that I did about fascism in football. I think it's the third one that's just on Spain. The films that we're going to be talking about mainly come from what I call the Francoism in decline, or the Franco light era. Because you can look at Franco Spain and there's two definite periods. There's 39, so the end of the Civil War, to about 1960, which I call high Francoism, uh, where the regime looks a lot like Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany. It's ideologically driven. There are a lot. Franco himself was not a fascist, but he chilled with a lot of fascists, and those fascists that he chilled with were in prominent positions. By the time you get to the 1960s and definitely the 70s, the regime doesn't become any less brutal. It's still extremely authoritarian, still far right wing, but it doesn't have necessarily the ideological mission or zeal that it did in its early years. In fact, I'd argue Franco Spain in the 60s and the 70s looks a lot more like the US supported military regimes in Latin America at that time, where right wing, military, anti-communist military figures are in charge, but there's no like big program to like change society or recreate like medieval happy Spain in some weird, modernity that's not capitalist but not socialist ever. That mission is aborted. But the democracy, it does not, you know, come back until Franco finally dies. But things change. And, before we get into the movies, just very briefly, a couple things happen. The first thing is the Cold War breaks out, and the United States, who's not really picky about allies during the Cold War, are like, oh, word, you hate communists? We hate communists too. We're going to forget about all that shit that you did during World War II and the fact that you and Mussolini and Hitler were boys. It's all cool.
Doesn't matter.
It does not matter. So, Spain, because of the Cold War, Spain is brought back into the international community, or at least the Western international community. Beginning in the 1960s, the country also starts opening up because they need money. Fascist economics was an absolute disaster. And so they need hard currency. And so Spain becomes kind of like Greece, kind of like Italy, that place in Western Europe where Northwestern Europeans, Brits, Frenchies, Germans go on vacation. It becomes a tourist destination. And with that, not just the movement of people, but the movement of ideas, the movement of goods, the society starts to slowly but surely uh, liberalized. Indeed, a buddy of mine who grew up in Spain in the 70s, where abortion and contraception was completely illegal. But he was lucky. He lived by one of these tourist camps. And
Okay.
so if you wanted condoms, you went to the hotels and were like, "Yo, I will drive you and your wife around this town for the week if I can get some condoms, man." Which think about living in a society like that, but this is when beginning the 60s and the 70s when things are changing. And then I Spain starts opening up, but Spain starts exporting its sort of refab identity to the rest of the world. And these films, some of the ones we're going to talk about, are part of it. I would argue Spanish horror, which becomes bankable in the late 1960s, helps create a different image of what Spain is. And also, too, and again, if you're interested in this, listen to the other podcast. Real Madrid's really fucking good in the 1960s, and they were on TV constantly. So I would argue by the 1970s, if you were British, if you were French, if you're German, even though Spain is still this dictatorship, that's not what you think of when you think about Spain. You think about, I'm gonna go there on holiday and I'm gonna drink a lot of cheap beer and sangria. I saw this weird movie at the drive-in, which I think is Spanish. And yeah, they're really good at football. And I think that's what by the early 70s, I think that's what a lot of, Western Europeans think about when they think about Spain, which is a little disturbing too, considering the country is still very much a dictatorship. Uh, Spain didn't really have much of a film industry before the 1960s, but then it becomes a destination for non-Spanish films.
Yes.
The Battle of the Bulge, a lot of these big Hollywood epics are filmed in Spain because it's fucking cheap. So if you didn't film in Yugoslavia, you filmed in Spain. Most of the Italian westerns that I absolutely adore were filmed in Spain with by Italian companies and with Italian casts. So co-productions uh start moving in, and you get this kind of not just a sort of golden age sort of of homegrown Spanish cinema, but really the golden age of Spanish genre cinema. Right, because by the 1960s, because some of the all of a sudden with different censorship laws and stuff, some of the stuff like the Mario Bava films from Italy, the Hammer films from Britain, stuff from the United States starts to come into Spain, and all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe we can make these movies too. When we were preparing this, the first thing that I threw out there was, well, the first two things I threw out there, and I promise I'm gonna let Dina talk, was okay, how do you make horror films or genre films, period, in a dictatorship? And then also, because these films were made in Spain, even if they're not in your face political, because in many ways they couldn't be, is Spanish genre cinema inherently political? So I was wondering what your thoughts on those two.
I feel like the ones that I've seen, like if I'm going off the Spanish genre films as a whole that I've seen, I would say yes. Because even you see the importance of what Franco did to Spain, even in like Guillermo del Toro's movies.
So I'm glad you brought that up because one of the movies that I have down in my notes, which
Pan's
is
Labyrinth.
one of, oh, see, that's okay. Pan's Labyrinth is the better of the two films.
Are you gonna say Devil's
The
Backbone?
Devil's Backbone is one of my favorite genre
Interesting, because
films.
I didn't love it. And I
I
recently watched it.
I think it's a matter of, so if you're more on the let's get political, but let's do like full-on magical realism, Pan's Labyrinth is
Is
your
your
movie.
thing for sure.
If you want to get all political, you want to engage in some magical realism, but you want something that's like gritty, and at the end of the movie, it's like, I want to just drink sangria to not feel myself. It's actually the Devil's Backbone.
You're not
There's
wrong.
yeah, it's the darker, it's the bit more
Yeah.
film, but I think both of those films absolutely. And that once Franco dies, by the way, all of the brakes are shut off, and filmmakers can make whatever they want. But I think it's very interesting that the real reckoning in Spanish genre film, the real let's use these films to have a conversation about the not so distant fucked up past.
Yeah.
It takes the freaking 2000s. The Devil's Backbone came out when I was at university.
Yeah.
And, that was the first of these films to have an honest to God conversation. But I think you're right. Even the films that were made during the dictatorship and certainly immediately afterwards are in one way, shape, or form kind of explicitly political. And we'll talk about some of these films uh in a bit. Uh One that is a big favorite of mine, I don't know if you've ever seen this, Cannibal Man from
Never
19
saw it.
okay, Cannibal Man is awesome. Cannibal Man was made in 1972 by Eloy de la Iglesias, who was he was a filmmaker of the left, but he couldn't really make the films he wanted to make, obviously, with the dictatorship still on. But he makes this weird little genre film, which is a critique. I'm not going to give too much away. 'Cause you've never seen it, but is a critique of particularly American style Western consumerism,
Okay.
which is taking over Spain at the time.
Sure.
And there's a couple scenes in the film which I'm shocked to get not past the censors because he's rather open about, let's say, policing, in Spain at that time.
Okay.
Right. There's a couple moments in that film where it's like, I'm shocked that you were allowed to film this because I know the dictatorship's on its way out, but like
But
it's
still,
there's still potentially going to be
for
problems.
sure.
And right, once Franco dies, then all of a sudden these Spanish filmmakers can get very political. A film which we may cover on the podcast proper because it's one of those films where it's not British, but it is filmed in Britain. It's in many ways it's kind of British, or its heart's in Britain, or parts of it's in Britain. So the Frankenstein monster, there are many parts. Uh Jorge Grau's The Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue.
Never saw it.
Okay, another one, and this one is way more. This was made the year after Franco dies.
Okay.
So
By who?
the director is Jorge Grau. He also did
Okay.
why am I drawing a blank? Blood Ceremony.
Oh, okay. I do
Okay,
know Blood
which is
Ceremony. Yeah.
the Elizabeth Bathory riff. Uh he makes this crazy movie about environmentalism that's like this weird anti-capitalist zombie film set in the countryside outside of Manchester. It's a really that actually, you know what? We will be doing that on the main pod because
Decision made.
I love this film. So right, it's kind. I would the reason I asked the question is yes, I think in a sense all cinema is inherently political, but in a country like Spain with Spain's issues, even more so.
Well, because what else do you talk about?
Exactly.
Like
Exactly.
for 40
And
years, like how do you not talk about that? That is your all of your existence and experience
using genre as a way to talk about it without in your
talking about it.
face talking
Yeah.
about it, I think I think the fact that you get this wave of Spanish horror films in the late 60s and the early 70s, just when Spain is starting to liberalize, it's no coincidence that these are the kinds of films these filmmakers are making because it's like we have to talk about this somehow in some way. Even someone like the great Paul Naschy, when you think about Spanish horror, it's one of the first names that comes up. Naschy himself wasn't particularly political, but if you watch his films carefully, there's commentary being made here, there, and everywhere. Naschy is actually a wonderful, connector here.
I think he's the reason that we even decided, which is funny because I didn't pick a Paul Naschy movie, but Inquisition was the reason that I
And
felt like we should have done this short.
yeah, which so that's the next thing we have to talk about is Catholicism and psycho-authoritarian Catholicism, which Inquisition deals with in a very real way. But so like when Naschy and his werewolf character, Valdemir Dominsky, not really Spanish, is it? When that series kind of kicks off the Spanish horror boom. And this is what I mean, like how do you do genre in a dictatorship? And by this point, the censors are like, okay, yeah, you can make horror movies now because we're not trying to create a new Spanish man and a new Spanish woman, so we're not going to police your goddamn morals. But, but bad shit can happen in Spain. So if you look at all of the early Spanish horror films, none of them are actually set in the country that they were filmed in. The Blind Dead series, which is classic, that fucking happens in Portugal, right? And it's funny because Portugal also had a right-wing kind of quasi-fascist military dictatorship, but eventually the Spanish censors were like, "Yo, bad horror can't happen in Spain, but if you want to piss on those guys across the border, knock yourselves the fuck out, right?"
Did Coffin Joe film his movies in Portugal or did he film them elsewhere?
Well,
Do you
he
know?
was Brazilian.
Oh my God,
He
you're
was
right. Oh my
Brazilian.
God,
But
sorry.
it
He
the
spoke
but the
Portuguese.
same thing, yes,
That's why I
but
said
the same thing kind of applies because like Portugal also a military excuse me, Brazil also a military dictatorship,
yeah.
but horror he got his films made until the Great Awakening of the Beast, where he just didn't give a shit anymore, and they were like,
Yeah.
"No, fuck it, this movie
Yeah.
was not getting seen." The early ones, which are a real damning critique of fascism. I mean, Coffin Joe is kind of, I don't know, goth
That's
Nazi,
really cool. Yeah,
right?
that's a
Talking,
cool way of
yeah,
explaining it.
he's a goth Nazi. But this it went over the censors' heads because they were like, "Oh, it's some silly horror movie. It's
Yeah.
not really addressing the situation." No, it really is. Uh, so. The Blind Dead films are set in Portugal. Nashi has to turn his werewolf character into a Polish guy, which, hey, I think is really cool. So I was like, yeah, representation. But then you realize later on, it's like, wow, he was told, like, you can't set this in Spain. Uh, but I think all of these films are still inherently political. And yeah, the next thing I have in my notes is Catholic tax. So Spain is a very Catholic country.
Yeah.
Spanish identity, much like Polish, much like Irish identity, is
Tied to Catholic.
tied to Catholicism. Much like Poland and Ireland, Spanish Catholicism at its best is a liberating force, at its worst is a slave shackle. And during the Franco years, it was very much a slave shackle. And part and parcel with the regime. You brought up Inquisition. Uh, Tell the good people a little bit about Inquisition because
It's been a really long time
uh,
since I watched it. So, but I mean, so I don't really remember a lot of it. I wanted to watch it for this. I watched something else. So you might have to tell them about Inquisition if it's fresher in your memory. But I remember being brutal. Like it was a brutal movie to watch. There's a lot of depictions of torture, which I mean, I don't know, I feel like all those movies during that time
well, and
is like that.
and also too, so Inquisition is Paul Nash's kind of answer to the Witchfinder General.
Yeah.
Uh, why am I drawing a blank on that freaking German movie, Mark of the Devil? Right, with the late great Udo Kier, who
Yeah.
passed on just this past week. Very sad for all of us here. Uh, and yeah, this was made literally the year before Franco died. And it's not set in Spain. I think it's set in France or someplace not Spain. But the film involves a witch hunting,
Yeah.
torturing Catholic priest. Self-hating, by the way. Nashi whips the shit out of himself a lot. But there's also this dynamic too that he is not totally on the level. Now, speaking as someone who is a cradle Catholic and, you know, in some ways worldview is still conditioned by Catholicism, not that brand of Catholicism, obviously. Uh, priests shouldn't be torturing people. Let's just keep that. Let's be clear about that. But that's not why he's self-flagellating. He's
No.
self-flagellating because he's a corrupt
Yeah.
piece of shit.
Well,
So
and there was a lot of that in the movie that I watched.
why don't you tell the good people the movie that you watched?
So I watched Viva la Muerte.
Which, by the way, if you do not know your Espanol, that translates to Long
Long Live
Live
Death.
Death, which was the motto of the Falange Party, Franco's party.
Yes, yeah. So and it was directed by Fernando oh my gosh, I did not want to say his last name wrong. I just wrote it down somewhere. Shit. You better edit this part out.
What is editing? Uh, but
No, it's fine. I don't really care. Oh my God, Arrabal. That's it. So sorry, Fernando Arrabal. So, and it's kind of a semi-autobiographical story. It's about his experience growing up in Franco Spain, specifically about his parents. His mother basically ratted out his dad as being communist, and he disappears. So the main character in the story, which is based off of him, Fando, he believes that his dad is dead, but his dad, spoiler alert, is not dead. He's in prison. So the film itself is really cool because it's so Arabal was friends with Jodorowsky, and
did an excellent documentary on Crazy Man Alejandro in the 80s that you should check out.
yeah, I was
Yeah.
looking that up. So a lot of surrealism, a lot of symbolism, a lot of extreme, it's not called extreme symbolism, but A lot of violence towards animals, which I don't love, but it is what it
Welcome
is.
to European
Yeah,
cinema in the 70s, guys.
so, and I get it, like they believe, oh, and I do agree, but like they have a bigger purpose. You got to do what you got to do for art, and fascism is really bad. So whatever. But the film itself, Bando knowing that his dad, realizing that his dad is still alive, he imagines these like what is happening to him, like these horrible things that could be happening to them. And oftentimes it's like very in your face, what's the word, like metaphors for religion and like the bondage of religion, a lot of like BDSM stuff, and elements of pop art too, which I thought was really cool. But he was friends with
Yes.
Andy Warhol, so it makes sense.
Also makes
Yeah.
sense.
But yeah, so I thought the movie was really good. I really liked it. There was one thing that I really wanted to talk about with you. So at one point in the movie, the mother, it's mentioned that the mother is scared of vultures and dogs. So I don't know what that means, but there's a part in the movie where Fando is at the theater and he's with his mother and they're watching a pro Franco propaganda film, which just that scene in general I loved. But behind them is a turkey, and it's very Jodorowsky to me because you're like, the fuck is this turkey doing here? What is he doing here? And then you see him again. So I'm like, he obviously represents something that I've been like racking my brain to try to figure out. But I wanted to go back to his mom really quick before I forget. So his mother, I felt like in the beginning of the film, I had this very like, she sucks. She's evil. Like she rats out her own husband. Why would a woman do something like that? Why would she tear apart her family like that? And I thought about two things. So one that we were talking about before. So we have this understanding, well, we understand femininity as being many things, but one thing is that we care, we love, we're kind, we're nice, we're motherly, we're all these good things. So then why the fuck is she ratting out her husband? And why the fuck is she doing kind of like really fucked up things too? Like she forces her son to flagellate her, like at one point, which I was like,
That is the
yeah.
scene which I have not seen this film in eons, but that is the scene that always stuck with me. I'm
Well,
like,
and not to be
ooh.
gross, but at one point, like he's whipping her. Oh, and like there was a quote that I loved. At one point they said, quote, the vicar will bless your whip, which I was like, wow, what a quote for fascism.
Mhm.
Like, I mean,
Yep.
seriously. So, but at one point, like I guess she can't take the pain of it and she grabs his genitals and inflicts pain on him. So that's the kind of person that you're dealing with here, is what I'm saying. But towards the end of the movie, I didn't feel sympathy towards her, but I did start to question whether or not this her choice to do that was actually politically motivated, or was it a motivation to protect her son? Because if anybody heard that his dad was a communist, what would have happened to the two of them too? So like there was this part of me that was trying to like justify it in feminist terms where I was like, well, I don't think it was political at all, actually. But I don't know. I think it's like up to you to decide.
So the last thing when I was making my little list of these are things we need to talk about was gender in these films because I in dictatorships there are never easy choices. I'm sure this is something when we talk about Eastern Europe later on in the series we'll talk about, right? There really isn't in capitalism, in Western democracies, there's limited choice. In actual dictatorships, it's even more limited.
But in patriarchy, in a patriarchal society, I think people often forget, and it's not just Spain that this happened to. This happened before. Like we see Vietnam and we see like how women and mothers were refusing or didn't want to send their kids to a war. They didn't want to send their sons to die,
Mhm.
right? But if you look at the United States First World War. You have a different kind of
Yep.
woman. And you have the women telling the men, you're not a man unless you go and fight. And I felt the same thing
So
with the
that
women in
is
this movie.
that is where I'm going here. So Spain was a incredibly hierarchical, incredibly patriarchal, incredibly Catholic dictatorship. In fact, I've heard the Franco regime described as clerical fascism, which I think actually, in a lot of ways,
It's
makes
interesting.
sense.
Yeah.
Unlike, the regimes in Italy and Germany, where you didn't have this strong relationship with the church in Franco's Spain, in Romania during the war, the vicar literally would bless your weapon, the regime, etc.
Yeah, the
Because
scene is
it's
insane because
it's
it's like passing guns and he's like, putting holy
yes,
water on them.
yes, which also shows you the sort of not just the uh intimate relationship between Catholicism or this brand of Catholicism and the Franco regime, but also too because the regime claimed to speak for all of Spain,
Sure.
the true Spain, Spanish identity itself. So in a weird way, the Franco regime inherited weird, strange ground when it came to how the patriarchy is processed, because I say this every semester in my classes. Every good system of oppression, when I say good, I mean not shit I like, but the ones that work when ordinary people are the ones doing the job of the police, the censors, etc. Good dictatorships really don't need, they're under policed. That's maybe a way to think about it because the people police themselves. And the film that you watched, when you told me, I was like, yes, thank God. Because the two things I remembered was weird Catholic woman getting flatulated by her son, and oh yeah, she turns in the husband. Not even for, we don't even know if he was a genuine
No,
communist.
we don't.
Someone who, because the term communist in Franco Spain could mean a lot,
Yeah.
right? It was kind of with this elastic turd for a term, not turd, term
Yeah,
for
they
everything that
actually
is
just called
bad.
them Reds. They never
Yes.
used the word communist. They always said Reds. So,
So, and this is something you see not just in, and by the way, the film that Dina covered and watched, certainly it sounds more like a political thriller. It's it's art house. It was a midnight movie. And
yes,
so it has
yeah.
a cult status. Uh right. In fact, that's how I stumbled upon it. It was like, oh, this crazy cult film from Spain. And then I was like, whoa, this is some weird anti-fascist acid trip. What the fuck am I watching?
So, and I wanted to say too, it came out in 1971,
Yes.
which was interesting because Sallow came out in 1975, and there were so many similarities in tone and the way it looked and the use of surrealism that I thought was really, really
I
cool.
think my man Pasolini probably saw the
I
same
was, yeah,
movie.
I was like,
Yeah.
it,
Yeah. Now that
that,
you say that, I'm almost
yeah,
positive
like there was just like this scene, like there's this one scene in Viva la Muerte where there's all these naked boys and they're just like running. There's a herd of them just running. And it just felt like Sallow. Like I was like, I felt like I was watching that
And
too.
I think it's interesting too, because he probably watched that film,
Yeah.
and this is, by the way, this is the good Catholicism. Pasolini was both a red and a devout Catholic. I wonder because the it's not just surreal imagery, it's surrealist Catholic imagery.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, because I mean, I feel like we're still having these conversations. Like I have these conversations with people all the time where you're like, bro, I had no problem with you being a Christian, man, but could you be one though? Could
yes.
you
Yeah,
actually be one?
yeah.
And so, like, and now in my old age where I don't have the resentment towards organized religion that I once had, I'm almost like, well, yeah, I do agree with these ethics that Jesus Christ supposedly said and believed too. So I do love Pasolini for something like for that,
Two
idea.
different, and maybe we can explore this in the Italy episode. Two very different readings of Catholicism in these two countries in Southern Europe. But anyway, going back to this point about you police yourselves, the Franco regime found fertile ground in these largely rural, not so much urban, rural sort of Spanish women, mothers, grandmothers who had grown up in these environments, that had grown up with the church, had grown up with this, we defer to the landlord, we defer to the priest, we defer to the local El Jefe, and they, over generations, internalize this.
Yeah.
And there's two of my favorite Spanish genre films uh directly address this. One is the absolutely incredible, and this, going back to Coffin Joe and like pulling one over the censors. 1969's absolutely incredible La Residencia, also called The House That Screamed, uh, directed by Narciso Ibanez Centaur. Uh, the film is, well, first of all, the film's incredible, and the ending is just like, what the hell? Uh, the film takes place in an all-girls boarding school for orphans. And right, there's this kind of quasi, part Oedipal, part sort of proto slasher, part kind of Frankenstein, really. Again, not gonna give too much of the film away. Uh, Story that unfolds. But, and this is where, again, the censors read this. It's like, oh, okay, this is some weird movie set in, I believe, in France. Okay, so bad shit is not happening in Spain. Make the movie. What the censors didn't understand is this film, this boarding school, is a microcosm of Franco Spain. The boarding school is Spain, and the boarding school is run like a goddamn concentration camp. But I think it's very interesting that it is a clearly, even though the guy who runs the school, pays for it, is a man, the people on the ground who run, make this camp system work and dish out the beatings, are all women.
Yeah.
It is the commandant is the, woman in charge, and her more favorite pupils. Because this is what I mean too. You have to make difficult choices. So,
Yeah.
like, being the regime's little pet, even though it will require you snitching, it may require you actually engaging. And this film's very upfront with some students, you know, it, doling out discipline. There are weird little perks in a society
Oh
where
yeah.
nothing's
Anything to,
on the
yeah.
level. Uh so you see it there, and then you really see it in a film which I think is criminally underseen. Eugenio Martin, who most genre fans probably know as the guy who directed Horror Express with Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, our boys, but also Dina's Group
What's
Part
the
Greek. Telly motherfucking Savalas as a Cossack. I love that movie. If people think of him, they think of that film, and that's a great film. That may be a film we also cover too, because it's one of those. It's kind of British, but it's filmed in Spain.
I almost
He,
picked that for my pick. I did. I almost, but then I decided for Venus and Furs. I was like, oh no.
both of them are very strong,
True.
and so he did a little film after that called A Candle for the Devil, which I don't think it's gotten a proper Blu-ray release. I have an old DVD copy. Print's decent, subtitles are good, which takes place in this small Spanish community, this rural village, right next to a tourist resort. So the film is dealing directly with this. Look, Spain has one foot still planted firmly in the 1930s because the regime has kind of stopped the clock. But at the same time, Spain is changing. So you get, these British tourists that come in, and this one sexually permissive British tourist gets offed by this old all black wearing psycho Catholic Spanish granny who has completely it. If you listen to, if you watch that film and listen to some of the dialogue, it's in your face. This woman has completely internalize the regime's language, its speak,
Mhm.
and it's this little old Spanish granny, not the local authorities, not the mayor, not the priest. That's the kind of, because that's the other thing. All of these dictatorships rely upon little fill in the blank. We think about Nazi Germany, we think about Hitler, but think about all those little Hitlers. Ditto the Soviet Union under Stalin. All those little Stalins that this regime created. Ditto to Franco's Spain. And in this case, it's this little old Spanish granny who is the little Franco. She's holding up and flying the flag for the regime in this little Spanish backwater town, and keeping, and I guess making, because that's the whole purpose of fascism, supposedly, making it great again, making Spain great again. It's a really, really interesting film. Yeah, I rip off the Band-Aid. Is it really, really? They see who's in the background. A really, really interesting film, underseen film that is ripe for a revisit. And yeah, it dovetails into this. Look, we have, I think, in particularly the West, maybe not so much this country now, but this, especially if you're on the left, this idealized version of femininity and what it is. But then, if you have conversations, let's say with feminists of color, they're like the biggest, you know, props of white supremacy are white women.
Oh,
And
100%. Yeah.
I think the
Well, and I was about
same,
to say that too. And like, I mean, we're not a monolith. So,
no, no,
like we're not,
no.
but
This podcast, nuance.
but yeah, I mean, I think that's what's so interesting about this topic is
Yeah.
like we're seeing it now. Like women can be like the better counterpart to men, I guess, but like we're not. Like, and what makes us actually better? Is it our ability to be more empathetic than men? But like they're not like that. So it's not a woman's trait as far as I'm concerned
Hmm.
or like whatever. Um but yeah, it's interesting. Like and I think being from the cultures that we're from, like I've seen a hard woman. Like
When we talk about Eastern Europe, which we will, and I watched a couple Eastern European films in the month of October in preparation for the high holiday. We will talk about this too because I think in Eastern Europe you see a similar dynamic. It's a little bit different, but if not for hard women, I don't know if anything would ever get done
oh yeah.
because, yeah, like, and
Yeah.
I think in this context, in the context of these films, it's kind of a really disturbing, perverse version of that, where it's not just if it wasn't for, the old Spanish grannies,
Yeah.
nothing would in this village would get done. In this case, it's these old Spanish grannies are actually cementing the, and in some ways, because the Candle for a Devil was made in 74, so the regime is on its last legs. They're really the last legs, the last props of this regime, uh, as it's starting to kind of, go the way of the dodo, which I guess is a good way to sort of get into the sort of the end of this. So in 19, going back, going full circle, in 1975, Franco croaks. Good. Uh, but we talked about this, you brought it up before. Spain doesn't start having the full-on conversation about those years, even in its genre stuff, until the 2000s.
Yeah.
Paul Naschy, who wasn't particularly political, attempted to make a movie, and this film did get released. I have a really not so great bootleg copy of it. It desperately needs. By the way, if any like Severin or Vinegar Syndrome, if any of you people are listening to this, freaking get a hold of this movie and clean it up, please. I will buy it. I will give you my money, which I normally do. Uh, a film called The Franconator, also under the title of The Sniper,
Cool.
1977. And again, Nashi wasn't particularly political. He just OD'd on Universal horror movies and was like, Wolfman and Frankenstein are cool. I'm going to make these movies in my country. He makes this kind of action film political thriller about a Spanish peasant who, I forget the exact plot. He loses a relative, maybe his son or something, and is like, okay, I'm gonna blow Franco's brains out.
Cool.
Yeah, this movie did get released, but it was a limited release, and he got sent straight up death threats
I'm
because
sure.
there are plenty of those old Spanish grannies or guys who
They hold on to that shit.
former regime
Yeah, they
people
hold on to it.
who were like, I'm gonna find you and I'm gonna fuck you up.
Yeah.
And I look, Dina's Greek. Greece and Spain have a disturbingly similar history in this regard.
Well, I was gonna say, so
Yeah,
like just I mean, gender wise, like my great grandfather fought as a fascist in the Greek Civil War. I'm not a fascist. And my grandparents are, and to this day, like if I said anything about communism, they would their response is always like, well, communists killed my parents, so they're all evil. But also, like, my grandmother can skin a pig and chicken and like do crazy fucking shit.
yeah,
You know
these
what I
are
mean? So I'm like, it's just a totally different mindset.
if
And
you
like,
if you want to see the Spanish version of Dina's grandmother, go see Candle for the Devil.
I just,
Uh
it's not even, it's true.
and look, I'm part Polish, I'm part Ukrainian. I still have family in those countries that experienced, in this case, left-wing political dictatorship. Those mindsets are hard to break. And I think one of the interesting things, and maybe we'll leave it here, is Spain is finally having conversation, but it took them, 30, 50 years to really initiate it. Because even though after Franco dies, the censorship laws are just thrown open. The other Franco that we're going to be talking about on
I
the
was just
main
about to
cast,
ask you about that.
Jesus Franco, which, by the way, I was going to save this for that, but we're talking about Spain. We should do it now. If there was ever a guy whose first and last name encapsulates 20th century Spain, it's that motherfucker.
Yeah.
Jesus Franco. When I think of Spain, I think of Jesus and I think of the other Franco. But he's allowed to come back into the country and make movies again because most of his stuff and most of the stuff that we love in his catalog couldn't have been made in Spain. He had to physically go to France or West Germany to make his movies. He comes back and he can you know film plenty of nude scenes with his girlfriend, soon to be wife, because that's what he did. But in terms of, if you look at a lot, with the exception of certain films, the conversation in Spain cinematically about the dictatorship kind of, there are some politically motivated directors of some art house films. But if you look at the films that are being made in Spain, like let's say in the early 80s, it's a lot of sex comedies. It's a lot of, okay, well, we can show all this stuff now, but we really don't want to talk about what just happened. And again,
So when you say like show stuff, do you mean like depictions of actual like fascism, torture, political unrest, or do you mean like sexual stuff?
movies,
Boob.
movies.
So,
Yeah,
because like during Franco's actual reign, are they making any movies in Spain?
they are.
But they're not made. They're it's so like
But you
Jesus
can't.
Franco and
So Jesus Franco has to go to France, and that's
yeah,
where he gets his start to make his films. Partially because they were, in terms of stuff, boobies, which
indecent.
indecent, and at times rather political.
Well, I was gonna say, so is it more, is the motivation to ban these kind of movies, is it leaning more towards like, well, we're Catholic and you can't show boobs and have sex? Or
So
okay,
a little bit of both.
okay.
So because here's the thing, like so by 1969, 1970, the Spanish censors have figured this out. Those guys in Britain, those guys in Italy, those guys at American International and Hollywood, they're making money with horror films. we can show a degree of violence in Spain, but not as much as people will see other places. And you definitely can't show boobies because Spain is Catholic and those Catholics frown upon boobies,
Yeah.
or public displays of boobies. Uh, I should, shame on me, I should have mentioned this. A lot of the Spanish films, if you go and you buy them on DVD now, you'll see that there's two cuts. There was a version filmed for the domestic market
Yeah.
with no nudity, some violence, but not necessarily toned down violence, still
Yeah.
kind of violent. And then a version for the international export markets, which it was just like, okay, everybody take the clothes off now.
See.
So, and after Franco dies, everything opens up, and you can show and be explicit about political violence and stuff. But again, with the exception of a few politically motivated directors, you don't actually see that many films dealing with that. And then again, going back to Nashi's film, he makes a film which is not even really it's political by default, but it's like more of a exploitation film.
Yeah.
And Homeboy gets death threats and is like, we're gonna break your legs.
Yeah.
So like,
Because you're poisoning the minds of people.
or that's over now. We were all complicit in it. We would rather not have that
Because that's what I'm
conversation.
wondering too. It's like
Let's
so
not have that conversation.
after 40 years
Mhm.
of ruling Spain, like, and then kind of going back to a democracy, like we talked about, like, does everybody just have like a collective like amnesia about the whole situation?
So
They know, or is it like a, I don't say like a Trump thing. We're like, well, yeah, we all know that was really bad, and we're really embarrassed by it, so we're just not gonna
a
talk
little bit
about
of
it.
both.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is even before the dictatorship dies, Spanish society and the way that Spain is sold to the outside world
Hmm.
looks a lot different because again, if you're American, British, West German, Italian in the early 70s, your first thing when you think about Spain is probably like Real Madrid, and that's where I'm going to go for vacation.
Yeah.
Not this is literally Europe's like one of the last holdouts of fascism in Europe. So I think it was kind of easy to sort of forget. I think some people in some parts of society it was probably like embarrassment, but it's also too Franco's regime lasted 40 years. And this is something because again, these from European connection. The Soviet regime lasted 70. The people that did okay in these regimes, even if you weren't a supporter, yeah, you have to ask yourself some difficult questions like, why am I still here?
Yeah.
Why didn't they come for me at 4 o'clock in the morning? What did I do or what did I not do? And I think that's the big thing. And in that sense, Spain is no different from Italy. Well, actually, I'd argue Spain's done a better job than Italy over the years. Uh, Certainly Germany,
Yeah.
right? And in that sense, Spain, I think, is really no different. Uh, but I do think it's interesting that when the conversation first starts to happen, which is in the early aughts, it's weirdly again through the lens of genre cinema. It's a Mexican director of Spanish descent who releases this crazy, weird horror film about the Spanish Civil War that then forces the conversation. And right, that process, the sort of trajectory of that process, even though there are still people in Spain that has do have good things to say about the old bad days you're seeing in Spain now, where arguably you have one of the more progressive governments in Western Europe, where, they're on the right side of, let's say, the Palestinian thing. Where there is finally a discussion being had about, well, okay, what the hell was that 40 plus years all about?
Yeah. I
How do we make
mean,
sense of it?
Well, now you have like, have you ever heard of the Jubilee?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking
Hmm.
about? That like freak of nature that said that he loved Franco and he was like, I love Franco and I don't see anything wrong with that. Okay. I
It's
mean, a lot of people would disagree with you. Spain, it looks like, would disagree with you too. I mean,
there's
they're not
still
searching for another Franco,
there's
it seems
still
like.
there's still Franco cheerleaders out there, but
It's crazy.
this I can say this, and I have quite a few Spanish friends. It is starting to finally they're having a long overdue genuine conversation
Which is
about
cool.
this.
I mean, because
And
it's still within living
it
memory, and we
is.
get to like actually see how mindsets
The
change.
fact that they're even entertaining moving Franco's body from that giant stupid fucking mausoleum with that giant stupid fucking cross is in and of itself kind of a huge deal.
Yeah,
Uh so and in some ways they're doing a better job of dealing with their history than other countries, like the one we live in. So we will kind of end it there. The one thing I will say before we leave is if you're interested in Spanish horror, Spanish genre cinema, there is a wonderful podcast put out by two dear friends, occasional drinking buddies of mine, Rod Barnett and Troy Gwynn, the Nashi cast. So it's not just Nashi films. They also do a little thing called Beyond Nashi, where they talk about other Spanish horror films, including Horror Express. So you can check them out. Right there, they usually put about 5 to 6 episodes out per year. And the other thing I wanted to say is join us on the main pod, the Christmas episode, which is Hammer's Cash on Demand. It's going to be dropping in a couple weeks. And right then, after the new year, we're going to be discussing sort of Spanish horror, or at least a Spanish director, but who also did work in Britain and for British money. We're going to be looking at Dina's pick, Jesus Franco's. As far as I'm concerned, this is the best thing Franco ever did,
I agree.
Venus in Furs. So this is Matt and this is Dina. This is the Don't Go Out Up on the Moors podcast, and we will be seeing you guys soon. Take care of your